As we venture into heterodoxy, here's a question. Why should there even be such a thing as orthodoxy or heterodoxy on a scientific question? Science makes a distinctive truth claim for how to think about the natural world. There should only be that which can be demonstrated and that which cannot. This is entirely contrary to the very notion of orthodoxy, or heterodoxy for that matter. Orthodoxy is, after all, a statement of authority. The literal meaning is correct doctrine, or righteous doctrine by some definitions of the word. Orthodox Judaism, for example, refers to conformity to the traditions and laws of the Talmud. Orthodox Christianity refers to adherence to the creeds laid out by the synods of the early church. I could go on. But science claims to be liberated from all that. Orthodoxy should be an entirely alien concept, as should heterodoxy. Which brings us to Darwinism and evolutionism, and why they have become flashpoints of cultural contention. If Darwinism and evolutionism were simply a scientific doctrine, this would make absolutely no sense. Scientific questions can either be demonstrated or not. But they're not simply scientific doctrine. Evolution is as much a cultural issue as it is scientific. And actually, it's right that it should be so. Where we came from, how we came to be here, the very question of our existence, all are deeply cultural issues. And evolution has some important things to say about that. But this is where orthodoxy and heterodoxy come in. As with all great questions, we need to navigate them carefully, humbly, and with an open mind. My contention is that we have not been doing so for more than a century now. Orthodoxy is doctrine, teaching. That's the meaning of the dox part of the word. There are many ways this can be accomplished. Among them is using myths and legends to inspire believers to the correct thinking. Here's an amusing example. The story is of a famous debate that took place on the 30th of June, 1860, at the Oxford meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. This was just about 1 year after the publication of The Origin of Species. The topic of the debate was to be evolution. It drew a large crowd packed into a large room at the Oxford University Museum. Among the speakers was Samuel Wilberforce, Anglican Bishop of Oxford. He was to deliver remarks because a few months previously he had written a penetrating critique of Darwin's book. Also on the platform was Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Huxley, who had emerged as a prominent defender of Darwin's ideas. Here's the mythical account of that meeting. For half an hour, the bishop spoke savagely, ridiculing Darwin and Huxley. And then he turned to Huxley, who sat with him on the platform. In tones icy with sarcasm, he put his famous question. Was it through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed descent from an ape? At the bishop's question, Huxley had clapped the knee of the surprised scientist beside him and whispered, "The Lord hath delivered him into mine hands." Huxley tore into the arguments Wilberforce had used. Working himself up to his climax, he shouted that he would feel no shame in having an ape as an ancestor, but he would be ashamed of a brilliant man who plunged into scientific questions of which he knew nothing. The room dissolved into an uproar. Men jumped to their feet, shouting at this direct insult to the clergy. Lady Brewster fainted. Admiral Fitzroy, the former captain of the Beagle, waved a Bible aloft, shouting over the tumult that it, rather than the viper he had harbored in his ship, was the true and unimpeachable authority. The issue had been joined. From that hour on, the quarrel over the elemental issue that the world believed was involved, science versus religion, was to rage unabated. Okay, pretty dramatic and inspiring. There's just one problem. The story is, to put it politely, an exaggeration. Today, we might call it fake news. There was a meeting. Wilberforce did direct a clumsy rhetorical joke at Huxley. Huxley did respond with a jab of his own. But the room did not dissolve into chaos. Fitzroy did not march around the room like a madman. The exchange between Wilberforce and Huxley was the typical thrust and parry that is common in debates like this. Nor did it garner much attention at the time. It didn't make the local newspapers. The official minutes of the meeting did not note the exchange at all, and it's doubtful that many in the room even heard Huxley's remarks. Both Huxley and Wilberforce thought each had got the better of the other, in fact. Not exactly the opening salvo of an epic confrontation between science and religion, in other words. The mythical story that did emerge came nearly 2 decades later, and it was the work of the sons of both Darwin and Huxley, Francis Darwin and Leonard Huxley. They pieced together their account from the self-serving he said gossip that emerged in later correspondence among the participants, and we all know what reliable testimony that can be. So why was the myth constructed at all? Aside from wanting to paint their fathers in a favorable light, Francis Darwin and Leonard Huxley were building a narrative of enlightened Darwinism against reactionary religion. That narrative sprung from somewhere other than the scientific question of evolution and Darwinism. From where, then? It cannot have come from any danger posed by evolutionism. Well, it's true that Erasmus Darwin's evolutionary speculations at the beginning of the 19th century had landed him into a spot of disfavor. His fall from grace was not so much that he challenged established religious authority, but that evolutionism had become unpatriotic. England at the time was at war with Napoleon. Evolutionism was regarded as one of those subversive doctrines that had poisoned the French Revolution. There was little sympathy in England at the time for such French ideas. But even then, evolutionism did not face a dangerous backlash. Others fared worse than Erasmus Darwin and his ideas. Remember that the chemist Joseph Priestley, who was similarly Francophile in his outlook, had a much harder time. Priestley's house was burned down. He had to leave England for America. Erasmus Darwin, on the other hand, was ignored by polite society. Once the Battle of Waterloo put Napoleon safely back in his box and a Bourbon king had been restored to the French throne, French ideas, evolution included, became safe again. In 1844, Robert Chambers, a Scottish publisher, put out an anonymous book, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, which brought evolution back into the mainstream of Victorian society. It was a controversial and widely discussed book, but it wasn't by any means a dangerous book. What sparked more interest was its author's anonymity. But no one suppressed it, least of all the Church of England. The Vestiges went through 12 reprintings, after all, and it was a very popular book. It made a fortune for both Robert Chambers and his brother and business partner, William. All this underscores the fact that by the mid-1850s, evolution had come to be fashionable opinion for the reform-minded and progressive upper middle class of England. So Darwin himself was quite safe. He would not be dragged up before an Anglican Inquisition, had such a thing even existed, of course. So, how did evolutionism, and Darwinism in particular, get dragged into a culture war of science versus religion? In the latter 19th century, Darwinism would seem to have been a poor choice for a battleground. Even as science, Darwinism was particularly weak, as we've seen already. But both Darwin and Huxley were famous figures, and Darwinism provided a handy cudgel. Which brings us back to Samuel Wilberforce. At the time of the Oxford debate, the Anglican Church was mired in an internal political struggle. Samuel Wilberforce represented one faction in this struggle, so-called High Church Anglicanism. The Anglican Church occupied the commanding heights of 19th century English culture, and one redoubt was the Oxbridge Universities, Oxford and Cambridge, which were institutions for training the Anglican clergy. Science at the Oxbridge Universities was mostly an amateur affair, the science of the English parson naturalists like Gilbert White, like, to be fair, Charles Darwin aspired to be. The mid-19th century was a period of sweeping reform in England, however. New political dispensations, a shuffling of the political deck, so to speak, brought on by the challenges of the Industrial Revolution. This reform spirit also was sweeping the Anglican Church. Emerging in opposition to High Church Anglicanism was a reform movement, Broad Church Anglicanism, which was keen to challenge the dominant High Church faction. They needed a weapon to do this, and standing ready at hand was a school of German biblical scholarship called Higher Criticism, or Historical Criticism. Higher Criticism looked to critically evaluate biblical text. Among its claims was that biblical scripture could not be trusted as authoritative history. Scriptural authority was what High Church Anglicanism was determined to protect. The Broad Church Anglicans were using Higher Criticism to undermine that. And voila, there was Darwinism, who undermined the biblical creation story as much as Higher Criticism did. The Broad Church reformers could now fling science at their High Church opponents as evidence of their backwardness. So we see that the supposed conflict of science versus religion was mostly a ginned-up controversy within the Anglican Church. Darwin was simply a handy tool in the battle. Darwinism, as science per se, had almost nothing to do with it. As for Huxley, he had his own reasons for jumping into the culture war. Huxley was at best a reluctant Darwinian. He was certainly Darwin's most vociferous defender, but he was, in fact, skeptical of Darwin's claims, and remained so for much of his career. To be fair, ongoing skepticism is exactly what we expect of a scientist. But Huxley was pursuing political aims of his own. Huxley was a tireless promoter of public interest in science and in advancing the interests of the emerging class of professional scientists like himself. He was, in his own way, steeped in the reform spirit that permeated England at the time. To Huxley, this meant clearing out the amateur naturalists that had dominated the faculties of Oxford and Cambridge, and to make those institutions more friendly to professional scientists like himself. The High Church faction, represented by people like Samuel Wilberforce, was a major obstacle to that. So Huxley's scientific and professional interests had broad parallels with the emerging Broad Church Anglicans. Huxley himself was not particularly religious. He's the person who invented the term agnostic, for example. But Huxley could present himself as a neutral observer, disinterested from the sectarian conflicts going on in the Anglican Church. The Broad Church Anglicans, for their part, could use Huxley as an additional weapon against their High Church opponents. It was a useful political alliance, a kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of realpolitik. So, the supposed war between science and religion, which Darwinism was supposed to have set off, was really a political war. This political dimension has endured, and it has dominated our public discourse over evolutionism and Darwinism for more than a century. The conflict comes up in different ways. In the United States, for example, it emerged in the rise of the late 19th century progressive movement. The progressives regarded themselves as a party of science, and they frequently employed Darwinian metaphors to advance their political aims. President Woodrow Wilson, for example, spoke openly about the need for a Darwinian constitution, whatever that is. The main point for now is that the progressives, like those Broad Church Anglicans, used Darwinism as a political tool. They didn't really give a hoot about the science. We see this cropping up again and again in repeated eruptions of controversy over the teaching of evolution in schools. From the Scopes trial to the present day, the conflict is always presented as a battle between science and religion. It is not. It is a political battle, not a scientific or even an intellectual battle. And it's the actual science of evolution that always comes up the loser. The question, therefore, should be, I argue, is how to get out of what has become an ossified, intellectually sterile, and overtly political stalemate over evolution. In 1997, the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould put forward a proposal to do so. It actually went nowhere, but it's worth exploring why. Gould took a page, ironically, from a doctrine of the Catholic Church, the magisterium. The magisterium is essentially the scope of the Catholic Church's authority to teach. The Catholic magisterium, in other words, is orthodoxy. Gould argued that there were actually two magisteria, one for religious faith and one for science. Each magisterium had different questions they could legitimately address. The science magisterium could address questions about the natural, material world, subject to empirical test. The religious magisterium could address matters of spirit and theology, using its own methods of inquiry. But neither could legitimately address questions outside their respective magisteria. The scientific magisterium could, for example, demonstrate the mass of the electron. The religious magisterium could lead to the revelation of the existence of God. But the two cannot overlap. The mass of the electron is not a subject for revelation. And on the other part, the existence of God is not a subject for demonstration. Not that people don't continue to try, of course. Gould argued that both science and religion could best advance if each stayed out of the affairs of the other, a philosophical version of good fences make good neighbors. When the fences break down, according to Gould, the result is both shoddy science and shoddy religion. When science breaks out of its magisterium, for example, the result is scientism. The temptation to a scientist who thinks expertise in one field qualifies him to opine on everything else. The most famous recent example of such scientism is Richard Dawkins, who thought he had something important to say about religion in his book, The God Delusion. What he had to say instead amounted to what I call schoolboy skepticism, the kind of superficial criticism that one finds among rebellious teenagers. When religion breaks out of its magisterium, the result can be, for lack of a better word, religiosity, a kind of assertion of presumptive religious authority over questions irrelevant to religious belief. The most famous example of that is scientific creationism, which claims to use scientific evidence to support the biblical accounts of creation. The science of creation science is, to put it bluntly, as shoddy as the scientistic musings of Richard Dawkins. This would seem to support Gould's association that the magisteria should never overlap. Allowing them to mix inevitably produces conflict and intellectual corruption. Well, I disagree. The very concept of the magisterium, remember, is a declaration of authority, of doctrine, of orthodoxy. Both science and religion, however, can also be philosophies of persuasion, not authority. And from this perspective, Gould's magisteria are, in reality, intellectual bubbles, places where everything makes perfect sense, just as long as everyone and everything stays confined within the bubble. Bubbles burst, however. In cultures of persuasion, not authority, this can be an intellectually fertile place to be. That is the realm of heterodoxy, which is exactly where I want to take us.